Hi guys, Olive here today to explore and react to the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction Longlist for 2024. The Longlist for 2024 was just announced this past Thursday, which is always a very exciting day for me. I love going through the list, exploring the different books. There are always so many books on the list that I've never even heard of. And I am someone who is pretty up to date with what's going on in the nonfiction book world, at least most of the time. And so that's kind of fun. It's surprising, but fun that there are new books for me to discover. It's one of the things I love about this prize. But I love going book by book, seeing what they talk about, who the author is, what other books have they written. Am I interested in reading this? Do I think it's going to move on to the short list? Do I think it might win the prize? That's always a really fun process for me, but it's a process that I normally do by myself. But I figured I would switch things up this year. I thought we could do that together. I will go through the long list with you book by book, talk a little bit about the book, about the author, about the subject matter, and I'm going to give you my general impressions on each one. So let's begin at the start of the list that they put on their website. I am going to be looking down at my laptop from time to time just to read you the titles of these books. These are nonfiction books, which means that they most often have subtitles, very long subtitles, and I don't want to commit them all to memory. I'm sure you can understand. So, the first book is Judgment at Tokyo, World War II on Trial and the Making of Modern Asia by Gary J. Bass, who is an American author. This appears to be a work of history that discusses the Asian equivalent to the Nuremberg trials. So following World War II, Japan's leaders were put on trial as war criminals. This author is a professor at Princeton, and judging from his other scholarly work that he's released, his other books that he's put out, this seems to be squarely within his realm of expertise, which does help to explain why this book is nearly 800 pages long. Now, this is a nonfiction book, so of course, maybe 100 pages of that is going to be all the end matter, like the citations, the end notes, that kind of thing. So maybe it's close to 700 pages, which is still incredibly long. This sounds very, very impressive, but do I have the capacity right now to take on this long of a book and a book with this particular subject matter? Probably not anytime soon. Next up on the list, we have another American author, Jonathan Blitzer, and this is a history book called Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here: The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. I love this cover, first of all, but it's a bird, so you probably already figured out how I feel about it. This author is a staff writer for The New Yorker, and in this book, he presents 40 years worth of information about the USA's relationship with immigration and with Central America, which has culminated in the current humanitarian crisis that we're seeing at our southern border. But it seems like this author weaves in a lot of personal stories that really put a human face on this issue. And I see that it's about 500 pages long. Of course, it'll be even shorter than that, given all the end matter that I just talked about with the last book. But it seems like the way that it's written, from what everyone is saying about it, it's written in a very compelling way. I'm sure it feels even shorter than that. Like the way people were talking about this one, I could really see it moving on to the short list. The first British author on this list is Rachel Clark for her book, The Story of a Heart. Did not need my laptop to remember the name of that one. Rachel Clark, or should I say Dr. Rachel Clark, is a palliative care doctor for the NHS. Before she went to med school, she worked in broadcast journalism. This is her fourth nonfiction book. The authors on this list are so incredibly impressive. They always are. This is a medical and personal history of a heart transplant. Rachel Clark tells us the story of a 9-year-old girl who was involved in a devastating accident. And as all of her organs besides her heart began to fail, her family made the choice to donate her heart, which went to another 9-year-old, a boy whose heart was failing as a result of his body fighting off a virus. So in this book, Rachel Clark tells both of their stories and the stories of their families. And as she's doing so, she weaves in information about the different medical advances, the medical marvels that have allowed this type of a transplant to happen. If you know anything about me and my reading taste, this is directly up my alley. I love books on medicine. I love books about people's personal stories. I can handle things that lean toward the emotional side. And even though this one sounds like it's going to be just devastating, like absolutely heartbreaking, I am sure it's going to be so beautiful at the same time. I don't know how far this one is going to go in regards to the Baillie Gifford Prize, but I do know that it's going on my TBR. Also, I really wish the Book Depository was still around because the UK cover of this one is just so much better. We've got another one from a British author called Melting Point: Family, Memory, and the Search for a Promised Land by Rachel Cockrell. I'm not convinced this one is even out in the US because I can't pull it up on Edelweiss. Regardless, this is the author's debut, and in it she discusses the largely forgotten Galveston movement, also known as the Galveston Plan, which, from my research, was an immigration assistance program in the early 20th century that diverted Jews who were fleeing Russia and Eastern Europe from New York City, the traditional destination, down to Galveston, Texas. And it just so happens that this author's great-grandfather played a part in that movement in some way, which I imagine is what prompted her to begin researching all of this. From what I read about this book, it seems like she presents her primary sources as is in the book itself. Like there's editorial work in the arrangement of all of these sources, but she allows the primary sources to tell the story, which I think is really interesting. I'd be curious to see all of those primary sources. It kind of feels like you're doing the research yourself, and I'm wondering if her close personal connection to the story is what prompted her to do things that way. But I'm a little bit conflicted because I do prefer that my nonfiction books have an authorial presence. Like, I like to be able to feel the author's presence. They're the ones who did all this research. I want to feel their storytelling. Like, it's just kind of editorial work versus writing if you're not the one taking charge of the narrative, in my personal opinion. I have conflicted feelings about this one. I'm interested, but I'm also off-put a little bit by the approach. So this one's going to remain a maybe for me, especially because I don't even know if I can get my hands on this one right now. Next up is Question 7 by Richard Flanagan, who is an Australian. And while this one has a nice short title and it is just over 200 pages long, the simplicity ends there because it's defined as genre-defying, which always means that you're in for a mind-bending book. And I'm just going to go ahead and read you the synopsis because I would have no idea how to even begin putting this into my own words. By way of H.G. Wells and Rebecca West's affair through 1930s nuclear physics, to Flanagan's father working as a slave laborer near Hiroshima when the atom bomb is dropped, this genre-defying daisy chain of events reaches fission when Flanagan, as a young man, finds himself trapped in a rapid on a wild river, not knowing if he is to live or to die. At once a love song to his island home and to his parents, this hypnotic melding of dream, history, literature, place, and memory is about how reality is never made by realists and how our lives so often arise out of the stories of others and the stories we invent about ourselves. If this author's name sounds familiar, it's because he's also the author of the historical fiction book The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which I know impressed a lot of people. Question 7 is another one that I am deeply intrigued by. Like, I would be interested in giving it a try, but I've got so much going on in my life right now that I just don't know if I can handle a really intellectually demanding book in the style of this one. So this is another maybe someday, just not today. And also, I have no idea how far this one is going to go in the prize. This is a little bit of an odd selection for them. More light reading. The next book on the long list is Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobson, who is another American, who has written a number of nonfiction books previously, but this newest one is about one specific scenario. She's considering what would happen if North Korea targeted the United States, more specifically the Pentagon, with a nuclear weapon. And she goes minute by minute talking about what could happen in such a scenario. And she goes minute by minute, notably, because that situation could cause worldwide Armageddon in a matter of hours, not days or weeks, hours. This sounds absolutely terrifying. Like, even briefly considering that scenario has me feeling physically ill, let alone reading an entire book about it. So just like I said with question 7, I just don't think I could handle that right now. I'm not exactly jumping at the chance to feel that terrified. Even so, I could see myself picking this one up before question 7 just because it's a more straightforward book rather than highly philosophical. So I feel like I would respond better to this one, even if I wouldn't sleep for weeks after reading it, and I already don't sleep well. Next up on the long list is A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, a memorial by Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is Vietnamese American. This memoir is from the author of The Sympathizer, which is a novel that won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction back in 2016, and in this first memoir from him, he discusses his family coming to America as refugees when he was only 4 years old, then his parents getting shot in the store that they were working in when he was 9. And it more generally seems to shine a light on the way that America treats immigrants and refugees. This is another one that sounds absolutely heartbreaking. I am wondering, though, if I should read The Sympathizer before reading this memoir, because I haven't read The Sympathizer yet. In my years of following the prize, it seems like there's always at least one biography on every single long list, and the first one on this year's long list is called Wild Thing: A Life of Paul Gauguin by Sue Prideaux, who is a Brit who has written a number of different biographies before. This one is about a French post-impressionist artist who I don't know much about, although Googling his name just now seems like however good of an artist he may have been, he was a pretty loathsome human being. So this isn't a very long biography, it's just over 400 pages, but knowing what I know right now about this man, I'm gonna have to give this one a pass, at least for now. Next up is the one translated book on this long list, and it is called Revolutie: Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World by David van Rijbroek, who is Belgian, and it was translated into English by David Colmer and David McKay, a team of Davids. This is another long one. It is nearly 700 pages long. It tackles the colonial history of Indonesia and what happened when they declared their independence from the Netherlands after World War II. This has been incredibly well reviewed thus far. This author wrote another book kind of similar to this one, except it was about the Congo. So he's very practiced with this style of book, so I imagine it's really good. I would be interested in reading this one myself, and I could really see this one moving on to the shortlist. Probably the most notable book on the list is Knife: Meditations After an Attempted Murder by Salman Rushdie, who is Indian British American. Salman Rushdie is a novelist who was famously attacked while giving a lecture on stage in 2022. He had been getting death threats for years. One of his novels offended certain Muslim communities, and they had been making threats on his life. So while this attack didn't necessarily come as a shock, it was still completely traumatic. He discusses that attack and its aftermath in this short memoir. I, of course, being a part of the book world and someone who listens to the news just in general, I heard about this attack. I know Salman Rushdie by name. I knew that there were threats on his life because of his writing, but I've never read any of his novels myself. So while I knew that there was a memoir coming out from him discussing this attack, I've always felt a little bit behind because I haven't read any of his other work. I think if I were to go and do that first, I would probably then go on to read this memoir. But in the meantime, I do think this one is going to be on the short list. The one author whose name I was already familiar with on this long list is the British marine biologist Helen Scales. She has written a number of different books on sea creatures and the ocean, so of course I know her name. Of course I know of her books. Those are my types of books. So her latest book was put on the long list. It's called What the Wild Sea Can Be: The Future of the World's Ocean, in which she discusses the impact of climate change on the world's oceans. Doing the type of reading that I typically do, I imagine I know most of the topics she's going to bring up in this book, but I am still really interested in hearing her takes. So this is one that will be going on my TBR, even if I'm not feeling super confident that it's going to move on in this prize. And the final book on the 2024 Baillie Gifford long list is by another American. It is called The Rebel's Clinic: The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon by Adam Schatz, who is the U.S. editor of the London Review of Books. This is another biography and another reasonably sized one. It is 464 pages. And that's remarkable to me because from what I read about this book, it's not just the story of the too short life of this intellectual activist, but it's also an examination of the development of his ideas and his writings. And also from what I read about this book, it seems like it's written in a highly accessible way, so that people like myself, who know virtually nothing about this man, could get something out of this. And knowing that, I'm definitely going to consider reading this. So that's the long list for 2024, and my impressions of this list overall are that in some ways this feels like a very typical Baillie Gifford long list, but in other ways it feels a little atypical. It's typical insofar as we've got a hearty dose of current affairs and history. We've got a smattering of biographies. But I feel like this year in particular is very memoir heavy. We always see a few memoirs on the long list, but I feel like we've got a lot this year. Maybe that's just my impression, but it feels that way. And also just looking at this list as a whole, it is a very heavy list. Now, don't get me wrong, the Baillie Gifford always considers more scholarly works and books that I would say are weighty with importance, like they discuss important subject matter. But I normally feel that on an average Baillie Gifford long list, we have moments of levity. We have some lighter books that could appeal to a more general audience or that discuss literature or pop culture or something along those lines. Something that's just a little easier to pick up. We don't really have that this year. I mean, the lightest books on this list discuss climate change and a heart transplant. This long list is a robust list, to be sure. All of these books sound excellent. If they're nominated for this prize, I imagine the writing is fantastic. They're all just a little bit overwhelming. Some of them with their size, almost all of them because of their subject matter. I would say the one that I'm actually anticipating reading is The Story of a Heart. It sounds a little weird to say that I would be excited to read a book that I know is going to destroy me emotionally, but it is my kind of book. I know that I am going to enjoy reading it. I'm going to get a lot out of reading it, I should say. All the rest of them are at best maybe someday types of reads. Some of them I feel like I need to do some reading before I get around to picking them up. Other ones I'm definitely not in the headspace for, and other ones simply don't interest me because I'm not super interested in the subject matter, and you kind of need that when going into a nonfiction book. I would recommend it anyway. So I am very happy for all of these authors. I can't imagine how rewarding it must be to be recognized for the enormous amount of work that you've put into writing books like these. So I'm so happy for them. Selfishly, though, I'm a little underexcited about the list this year, but that's just my take. Please let me know what you think of the Baillie Gifford long list for 2024. Which, if any, books caught your attention? Have you read any of these already? Do you think they're going to win? How do you think most of these books are going to fare going forward with the prize? I will still be following along, even if I'm not super excited about each and every book on this list. I always like to see how things turn out with nonfiction book prizes. If you want to know more about the Baillie Gifford, of course, do check out their website, which I've linked below. You can also watch that video I made on nonfiction book prizes for more information about the history of this prize, who is eligible, what they win, all of that kind of stuff. That will be linked for you below and up in the cards. All of the books that I did mention today will be listed and linked for you in the description box below for your clicking convenience. At the very bottom of the exact same description box, you will also see everywhere you can find me around social media. So my Instagram, Goodreads, and Storygraph, where I keep track of my reading. Those will be linked for you if you would like to keep up with what I'm reading and doing right now. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I will see you in the next video. Bye.